all the possibilities to match this curve perfectly is the only one we found so far. And the demographic distribution that it asserts seems highly implausible. But again, we need to do more research. One is, again, as I mentioned, that there could be certain groups of independent voters that are not visible in the model, or it could be vote swapping, or all three. And I'll end on that note.
All right, Dr. Shiva. I'm looking at Mr. Giuliani, and I see he's been scratching some things out here. I'm pretty sure you have a question or two.
I do, sir.
Please, sir.
Doctor, it's Rudy Giuliani. How are you?
How are you, Mayor Giuliani?
Can I just ask you, how did you get to that calculation where Trump received minus 30% of the Democrat vote? Can you explain to us in a way that we can understand how you got to that calculation?
Sure. So let me go back to it, if I can go back to it. So think of this, Mayor Giuliani, as if you think about this, this is a curve that represents the actual vote, what's called the cumulative vote count for Mr. Biden and President Trump. Okay, so this is the control. This is what actually occurred on election night. Does that make sense? And what we're attempting to do in mathematics, using mathematics, you can do what's called curve fitting, where you can change certain variables to attempt to fit this curve. The variables we are changing here, which cannot be done, manually, but the computer is essentially changing the possibilities of different levers, the percentage of Democrats who voted for President Trump, the percent of Democrats who voted for Mr. Biden, the percent of Republicans who voted for Biden, the percent of Republicans who voted for Trump, the percent of independents who voted for Biden, the percent of independents who voted for Trump, and so on. So it's a solving where, remember in algebra where you could multiply variables by different equations, and you're trying to match this curve. So the computer is doing this, Mayor Giuliani, and so that's why I'm showing you this different possibilities. Now there's hundreds of thousands that the computer is running through to figure out what possible, as you can see here, what possible combination of these would lead to this. And the only one we were able to find was this. I hope that explains it. We're looking at the computer trying to find combinations of these vote allocations that could perfectly reproduce this result.
So a vote for Biden would actually be 1 1/3 vote. Is that correct?
Yeah, 1 3/10, right? So
1 3/10.
So Biden got one vote.
1 3/10, and a vote for Trump would be what?
A vote for Trump would be whatever the president got, if he got 100 votes, reduced by 30% of what Mr. Biden got. Basically, the president's vote is linked to the vote that Mr. Biden got. So if Biden got 100 votes and his went up by 1.3, which means it took 30% of the votes were reduced that would go to President Trump. So basically, votes are being eaten from President Trump and handed over to Mr. Biden. That's the only way to, one possibility of explaining.
Did you discuss this at all with Colonel Waldron?
I received a text message from this earlier, and in preparation for this, I wasn't able to get to him, but I'm willing to discuss that with him.
Well, he reached a very similar conclusion in a different way, that the votes for Biden were valued within the computer algorithm as higher than the votes for Trump. Could you accomplish that within a computer that you had gotten control of?
Well, one of the important things to recognize is that what we do know is, starting in 2002, Mayor Giuliani, that these voting vendors, it was brought out in one of the Diebold manuals, have a feature called a weighted race feature. The weighted race feature, it's a documented feature. And the weighted race feature basically says that the feature in the software, which the secretaries of state have certified, knowingly or maybe unconsciously, but they must have certified these electronic voting system software, has a feature called a weighted race feature, which allows a voter's vote to be, or a candidate's votes to be multiplied. So what that means is the central principle Justice Earl Warren ruled on in 1964, one person, one vote, or clarified that, can be violated. It can be one person, not one vote. And that is one explanation of this. But the important feature I think people in the public need to understand is these software systems, the electronic voting software systems, have a documented feature called a weighted race feature. So the implementation of this is very possible. In fact, it's a documented feature starting as early as 2002.
Is there any reason for that? Any legitimate reason? Don't you want to count every? Don't you want to count every vote as one?
Every vote should be counted as one vote, but the fact that a weighted race feature exists should be of serious concern to all of America, because it basically means that all of us have been going, we're going back to Dred Scott, where it means that all of us, in some ways, the ubiquity of unfairness, where at that time it was 3/5 of a vote, where we could all become, 1/3 of the vote. In this case, the people who voted for President Trump approximately were becoming 7/10 of the vote.
Do you know if the Dominion machines have that weighted vote feature?
As I understand, if the fact that the votes are stored as decimal fractions means you could have external programs intersect, communicate with those programs and alter them using external software programs, which could also do weighted race features. But the important element here is that there's documented features of the weighted race feature as early as 2002, and our votes are stored as decimal numbers.
Would I be overly simplistic if I concluded the only reason you would want a machine with a weighted vote feature is in order to cheat?
It's enabling cheating. It's an enabling of one person, not one vote.
I mean, this is not a poll.
That's what the feature enables.
This is not a poll. This is an absolute vote. And the only reason to have that feature would be if you're going to distort the vote.
Exactly.
Do you know what a Monte Carlo is?
Excuse me, Mayor Giuliani?
Did you do a Monte Carlo where you can do millions of possibilities in a minute to find a good match?
Yes, so that's what this is doing. There are many different techniques. The solver technique here, there are many different numerical methods, but essentially it's doing one of those kinds of approaches to find that fit. Exactly.
And that's how you arrived at the one that you felt was the closest?
Yes.
And could you say with a degree of professional certainty that there's no question that this vote count in Arizona is faulty, false, not accurate, whatever words are comfortable?
Well, I think what I can say is that the plausibility of that, the cumulative vote count as we see it progress is highly implausible. The caveat being we don't have certain data on what percentage of demographics of independent voters, but from everything we've run and the simulations we've run, it's highly implausible the pattern of voting we saw that was reported by the Secretary of State of Arizona in Maricopa County.
Thank you, Doctor. Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
Members, any questions for Dr. Shiva? Any questions? Representative Cook, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just have a question for the doctor. So earlier we had heard from a state senator, I believe, and in his presentation, when it had the vote totals, it had a decimal point and then numbers after. And so this perfectly makes sense if what you're saying is one vote is one vote, two votes is two votes. But if there's some way there is something added to it electronically to have a weighted vote as a 1.25, so every vote for this person is a 1.25, would that be the way those decimal points got there?
Well, yeah. I mean, the issue is why are our votes being stored not as whole integers versus what we're called floating point variables in computer science or in math, right? So when a developer writes a program, it should be very important. I've been programming for many, many years. And the first thing you learn is when you are writing a software program, you have to be extremely conscious on how you're declaring variables, right? This variable is an integer, which means it can only be, 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. this variable is going to be a decimal, which is also called a float or a double, which means it can be 1.1, 1.3, so on. So the fact that the vote count is stored as a decimal, to me, when I first learned about this in my own Senate race here in Massachusetts, it was quite disconcerting, because this means that consciously people are putting into the software a capability to have fractional voting. And that's what this leads to. And why is there such a feature or capability, and why are our votes even being stored as fractions or decimals? And I think this is probably the central question of our time, probably going back to, the 3/5 compromise of 1787. Do we have one person, one vote, or do we have one person, not one vote? And in the era of electronic software systems, I think the courts need to step in and re-clarify one person, one vote, going back to 1964, the Equal Protection Clause of the United States Constitution.
Mr. Chairman.
Okay, ladies and gentlemen, we got a lot of ground to cover here, so I appreciate your passion, but can we just keep the applause to let's wait until we're done. Senator Borelli, you have a question?
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Well, I'm not surprised. It's pretty much the modus operandi of the Democrat history anyway, to have a poll tax and actually tax the Republican to that vote goes to a Democrat. So that's what they did. They took that 30% or 0.3, whatever, tax the Republican vote and send it over to the Democrats. So I'm not surprised that the Democrats would want to tax the vote.
Mr. Chairman.
Okay, members, any other questions?
I wasn't finished.
I'm sorry?
I wasn't finished, Mr. Chairman.
Oh, I'm sorry. Please proceed, Mr. Cook. I thought you were done.
Thank you. I just wanted to finish up with what we're going to talk about. So now that we understand with the two witnesses that we've heard here today, how those decimal points gets in there, and Doctor's done a wonderful job. The question I have, Mr. Chairman, Doctor, is when did you find this information about where the lines transected? At what point in time were you made aware of it? That's the first part of the question. And the second part of the question is, who have you made aware of this? Have you made the Secretary of State of Arizona aware of this, or the Governor's Office or Attorney General's aware of this? Or has it just been the privileged information of the Trump team until now, just about the state of Arizona, so we keep it short?
No, this was discovered about 24 hours to 48 hours ago. You're the first ones to actually see these graphs presented today.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for your time.
Representative Townsend.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I just have a quick question built off of a comment. Sidney Powell had mentioned some conflicts of interest with Dominion and these systems. She had said, her words were, governors and secretaries of states and other politicians have a vested interest in this system. I read from last year an article where Nancy Pelosi's former chief of staff sat on the board of the lobbying firm that represents Dominion. If what you're telling us is true, and there is some kind of interest by certain politicians to invest in this kind of a system, and I find it ironic that today is Cyber Monday and we're talking about this type of issue. Have you looked at that, of any kind of a nefarious background when you're looking at these weighted votes? Do you have any indication or any suspicion, or is this just a mistake or a fluke in data? Does this lend to her claim that there might be some nefarious motives behind this system?